And once again, good morning, church. This Advent, we're listening to each of the four Gospels, as each of the Gospel writers tells us what he wanted to emphasize about the most meaningful story the world has ever heard. So we opened Advent season with the introduction to the Gospel of John to hear about the Word made flesh, God becoming human, incarnate, in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the unique Son of God. And last week, we looked at Mark's presentation of the beginning of the story of Jesus. Mark opens his gospel with John the Baptist emerging from obscurity, baptizing in the wilderness. And Jesus then bursts upon the scene with a heavenly visitation at his baptism. God himself affirms his unique and beloved Son, who has come as the servant of Yahweh to rescue God's people. Today we turn to a more familiar part of the traditional Christmas story in Matthew's gospel. Matthew tells us more of Joseph's side of the story, but he isn't primarily interested in Joseph per se, but in Joseph's role as a descendant of David. For Matthew is most concerned about presenting Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, the promised Son of David, who is the rightful King of Israel and the King of the kingdom of heaven. Matthew's concern doesn't just show up in his telling of the birth story, however. Throughout his gospel, Matthew emphasizes three key points as he presents Jesus to his readers. First, as the Messiah, Jesus fulfills what the prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures predicted. He is the one to whom the prophets pointed, the one that God promised to send to his people. And Matthew repeatedly reminds his readers that what Jesus did or said or what happened to him or happened around him was a fulfillment of a prophetic statement found in the Scriptures. It is like a constantly recurring refrain that continually intones this theme. This was done to fulfill what the prophets said. Secondly, the Messiah is the king who has come to rule over God's people, Israel. Matthew goes to great lengths to emphasize over and over the royal nature of Jesus' person and his ministry and his message. In Jesus, the Son of God, the kingdom of heaven has come near. And in his ministry as the Son of David, he heals. He heals the sick. He feeds the hungry. He speaks with absolute authority because the king's word is law. His message is all about the kingdom of heaven, God's governance of his people. And Jesus is the king of that kingdom, the only one who rightly understands God's will, who alone can bring about God's rule over this world. And then thirdly, the kingdom of the Messiah is not limited to Israel, but is to be taken to the nations so that they may also live under his blessing. Repeatedly in Matthew's gospel, we see the seeds of this surprising aspect of Jesus' message, particularly at the opening and the closing of his account. And this point about the kingdom being extended to the Gentiles is a key theme in the passages we read this morning and the surrounding context of the birth narrative. Now, Matthew starts his narrative in good Jewish fashion with a genealogy. Why would he do that? Well, quite simple, really. Matthew wants to establish that Jesus is descended from King David and is therefore a legitimate claimant to the throne of Israel. And although Matthew doesn't point it out explicitly, the claim to be a son of David is tied to a prophetic promise in the Scriptures. In 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 14, the prophet Nathan brought the word of God to David. And God promised David that he would take one of David's heirs and set him on his throne, that is, ruling over the people of Israel, and that his kingdom would last forever. Whoever claimed to be the Messiah, the promised one, had to be a descendant of King David. Well, Matthew also points out in his genealogy that Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. And at first glance, you would think, well, this is unnecessary. David was a descendant of Abraham, so all of David's descendants would automatically be descendants of Abraham. But part of the reason that Matthew includes Abraham in the genealogy of Jesus is simply formal. All Jews trace their ancestry back to Abraham. He was the first of the patriarchs to whom God gave the promise that he would take his descendants for his people. But there's a more subtle reason that Matthew includes Abraham. And again, it is tied to a prophetic promise related to God's purpose in selecting a people for himself. Because in Genesis 12:3, God announces to Abraham that through his seed, through his heir, all the families of the world would be blessed. And the kingdom of God and all of its blessings were always intended to be taken to the nations. And Jesus is the heir to whom that prophecy referred. So when Matthew turns to the task then of telling about the birth of Jesus, he begins with Joseph. Now, generally in our day, people who know anything about Christianity or Christmas, well, they know that Joseph was a craftsman, a carpenter, a builder, and that he was poor. And we learn that from what we read in other Gospels. But Matthew doesn't mention any of that here. Notice what he does tell us about Joseph, though. He starts by pointing out that Joseph was a devout man, a righteous and faithful man, an observant Jew who lived according to the commands of the Mosaic Law. He was a loyal son of Israel. Matthew's far more interested in letting us know about Joseph's spiritual character than his economic situation or his social status or his line of work. For none of those things mattered to God, something that you and I perhaps ought to remember a little more often. What mattered to God was Joseph's faith and his faithfulness, his dependence upon God and his willingness to obey what God said. And that would be demonstrated repeatedly in this brief account of Joseph's care for Mary and her child. The other thing that Matthew highlights is Joseph's status as a son of David, someone who was in the royal line. Now, David had been dead for nearly 1,000 years, so there were undoubtedly a multitude of people who could claim him as an ancestor. But the royal line had been broken at the time of the exile to Babylon. No son of David had ruled over Israel for nearly 600 years. Yet the angel who addresses Joseph does so with a royal title. Not because God intended for Joseph to claim David's throne, but because this son is the rightful king whose status as an heir comes through this surrogate parent. Now, we shouldn't skip too lightly over the fact that Joseph is addressed by an angel. Yes, it comes in a dream, but it's still an angel. And generally in the Scriptures, when an angel appears and addresses someone, it is an indication that the person who is addressed is someone whom God favors and whom God intends to use for a special purpose in bringing about his deliverance or his blessing for his people. Likewise, by instructing Joseph what to name the child to be born, the angel is granting Joseph the parental right to name the child, implicitly recognizing Joseph as the one who would assume the role of parent, stepfather, despite the fact that the baby is not his own natural child. God thus acknowledges Joseph's importance, not only as the one with the legal ancestry to give to the child a claim on the throne of David, but as the one who will stand in the role of father to a child, who will protect and raise this child as he grows up. And while Matthew emphasizes Jesus' status as the king, he adds two important qualifiers about this kingship. These are new revelations concerning his status and his role. First is his role as king to save his people. That in itself was not new. That the Messiah would save his people was something that every Jewish person would have known and affirmed. What was new was this: he would save his people from their sins. So his name, Jesus, Yeshua in Hebrew, was significant. It meant Yahweh saves. Second, he makes an exceedingly important observation about Jesus. His birth fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14 about a virgin giving birth. And this son of David is therefore also the Son of God. His birth is the result of a miraculous conception. And the Son of David is not only a royal Messiah, he is Emmanuel, God with us, born of a virgin to enter life in our world as one of us. Now, those 2 points about Jesus' status and his role as the Messiah are crucial for understanding who Jesus is and why his birth was so significant. We could go on and on and on about just those 2 things. Matthew's going to add another important fulfillment of prophecy. He's going to include the prediction by the prophet Micah that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. But when Matthew is telling the story of Jesus' birth, what he gives most of his attention and time to is what happened after he was born. And in that part of the story, there are 2 primary characters, each of whom represents a crucial part of what Matthew wants us to know about the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. The first of those characters is a group, an unspecified number of foreign visitors from an unnamed land in the east. Matthew tells us that they were magi, members of an elite class of religious scholars. They were famous throughout the Near East for their knowledge. Their knowledge that was a mix of what we would term scientific knowledge, such as the relative positions and movement of the stars, a mix of that and astrological or religious interpretations of what they observed. These magi who came to Jerusalem were also familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures, either from their own study or from contact with the Jewish communities in their lands. For they reported to King Herod that they had seen something in the skies which they interpreted as an omen specifically connected to the people of Israel, the birth of their king. And they also recognized something else, that this event, which was signaled by the appearance of this astronomical sign, was a personal summons to them. They must come. They must come and bear witness to what they had seen. They must certify the birth of this child, and they must respond with proper obeisance and honor. Now, Matthew does not give us even a hint of what the Magi saw beyond the fact that it was a star-like appearance, nor of how they recognized the significance of this occurrence. That, however, has not stopped the growth industry of speculation about either the Magi or the Star of Bethlehem. And so we now have nearly a full-scale mythology that has developed around the Magi. You know, who they were, how many there were, their names, their places of origin, how they met, the star that they saw. And there are plenty of books and websites offering various explanations of the astronomical phenomena indicated by this statement from the Magi. And many of those books and websites claim to be able to unlock the secret of what the star really was. And so I would say to you, read them if you like, but do so with a generous spoonful of salt and a firm grip on your wallet. You see, Matthew's story of the birth of Jesus and the visit of the Magi is not intended to send us off on a search for astronomical verification that the event really happened. It's intended to send us off on a search for the one whom the Magi came to worship. Matthew wants his readers, that's us, to understand first that the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem signaled that the Son of God, the King of the Jews, had come in fulfillment of Micah's prophecy, and second, it was now time for the Gentiles to come and join God's people in worship of the divine Son in fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham that his heir, his seed, would be the one through whom all the nations of the world would be blessed. Matthew also wants us to realize the significance of their response. The Magi demonstrate what should be the proper response to the birth of the Son of David: acknowledgement of his kingship, joyful worship to honor his deity, sacrificial giving, and adoration. Well, the response of the Magi is also a stark contrast to the response of the other primary character in this story, and that is King Herod. Herod was an Idumean with a Jewish grandmother on his father's side. His ancestors had converted to Judaism. He was raised as a Jew, though he was somewhat selective in his observation of Jewish customs and laws. And Herod may not have been fully observant as a Jew, but he was shrewd and he was ambitious. And following Jewish laws may have been a part of his adopted identity, and it was politically advantageous when doing so served him well. But what he cared most about was gaining and preserving power and position. And so when Herod heard that foreign visitors, nobles, were claiming that an omen had signaled the birth of the kingdom of the Jews, which Herod recognized meant the prophesied Messiah, he was disturbed. That's a nice way of saying he was infuriated. And because he was such a vindictive tyrant, when Herod was disturbed, everyone around him was disturbed as well, because you didn't know whose head would be rolling next. And we stopped reading in Matthew's Gospel this morning at the point where the Magi returned home. The next section tells of Herod's response, what he had planned to do when the Magi informed him of where to find the baby. The possibility of a rival gaining power over him, even when that rival was divine, evoked Herod's wrath. He was vindictive, vicious, paranoid, and determined to destroy every challenger to his rule. At this time, Herod had already killed, he had already killed several of his own sons and one of his wives because he viewed them as a threat to his throne. It would completely be in character for him to eliminate a similar threat and by similar means. And the slaughter of a handful of male babies in a small village would take care of the matter, and no one of any import or influence would notice or remember. Or so he thought. But one baby escaped him, and Matthew found out, most likely from Jesus' family. Herod is the consummate picture of the power-hungry king, the worldly ruler who defiantly refuses to submit to God or acknowledge his sovereignty. And Matthew's account of Jesus' birth cries out to be read in the light of the other passage we heard this morning, the second psalm. A psalm that was widely recognized in the first century as being prophetic of the Messiah. Unlike the Magi, Gentiles who had come to worship in response to the sign that the King of the Jews had come, the pagan kings in Psalm 2, like Herod, refused to acknowledge God's rule at all. Not only will they not submit to the Messiah, the Son of God, whom God has appointed and set on his throne, these pagan kings will not even admit that God himself has any authority over them. They bristle at the very idea that anyone at all, including God, should constrict them with rules and commands and laws which they must obey. They chafe under God's moral demands and shake their fist at the sky. Who are you to command me? I refuse to submit to your outdated notions of right and wrong, your oppressive limits on the free expression of my desires, your boring insistence on morality. And God, who is quite secure on his throne in the heavens, laughs. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. And his warning is not an empty threat either. Kiss the Son, that is, acknowledge the Son, submit to him, come under his rule. You've probably seen pictures of like this in a movie when a knight or someone kneels and kisses the hand of the sovereign to say, you are my sovereign. If you will not do so, God says, his wrath will overwhelm you. The psalmist says, you think you're some mighty ruler? Just wait until the Son comes in power. The significance of Matthew's story, the birth of Jesus, for us is great. And it adds a critical aspect to our understanding of what Christmas is about. The story of Christmas is not just about the Prince of Peace. It's not just a warm, motherly tale about a gentle young woman giving birth, surrounded by cuddly animals and adoring peasants. It is also the story of God confronting the rulers of this world and all those who oppose him and his governments, who refuse to acknowledge God by yielding to him and submitting to his rule over them. The story of Christmas takes us back before the creation of humanity, when an archangel rebelled and said, I will put my throne above that of the Most High. It takes us back to the Garden of Eden, when the first humans listened to the voice of that angel who told them, you will be like God. You can be your own gods. It takes us back to the kings of Psalm 2, who insist on breaking free from the shackles of God's governance, from the prison of living according to godly laws, with moral requirements that come from the Creator instead of from our own twisted desires and the lies of the enemy. It takes us back to Herod, who would do whatever was necessary, including the slaughter of innocent children, in order to preserve his own rule and prevent anyone from taking away his right to do whatever he saw fit. The story of Christmas takes each of us to the innermost reaches of our own heart, to that voice in us that screams out, I will be my own God. I will rule my own life. No one will tell me what to do. Now, the Western world today, and the U.S. in particular, are not unique at all in our refusal to live under God's governance. Our society is not especially wicked in contrast to others. But godlessness and rebellion and the refusal to live according to God's ways is especially prominent and very loud right now in our own part of the world. Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus calls to us in just such a world. For Jesus was born into a world that in many ways was just like ours. Selfish, divided, ruled by power-hungry, defiant rebels who fought relentlessly to stay in power, knowing that they were surrounded by others who were happy to take their place when they were toppled. And we need to hear his story this Christmas. Sentimental movies about romance in small towns, stories of angels getting wings, of Santa Claus in the North Pole, helping the poor, reconciling with family, these are not necessarily bad things. There's a lot of good in these stories. But none of them grasp the importance of Matthew's primary emphasis, the reason he told his story of the birth of Jesus in his gospel, his presentation of the most important news that's ever been announced. Matthew says to us, listen, the King of Israel is born. The Son has come. The Son of David, who is also the Son of God. He is the one who has come to bring God's kingdom to us so that the whole world can be put right. But instead of welcoming and worshiping him, the king who was ruling at the time tried to kill him. And his own people rejected him. And the kings of this world refused to come to him, refused to yield to him, refused his governance over them. Matthew's gospel, his announcement of good news, is that the Messiah has come, which is good news not only for Israel, but for the whole world. He came to save us from our sins, to win us back from the rebellion in our souls that had estranged us from the God who loves us. But only a few responded with right hearts. Only a few bowed to honor him and submitted to him. The Messiah of Israel, who had come for the whole world, would be rejected by the leaders of his people, handed over to a Roman governor to be crucified. Because he was the Son of God and could not be kept in the tomb, he was raised again to life, and the message of his salvation is being sent to the whole world, to all who will acknowledge him as their king and come into his kingdom to live under his rule. The importance of Matthew's part of the Christmas story for us has been stated in a clever proverb that's become somewhat of a cliche. Nevertheless, it's powerful because it's true, and that is that wise men and women still seek him. I'd like you to watch a short piece as we close.